is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. NATO says it will train and support the Ukrainian army, but it will not join the fight against Russia if it invades. Our other headlines, the DPRK carries out a test launch of its biggest missile since 2017, the seventh launch this month. Paying for the pandemic. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Finance Minister Rishi Sunak say they'll raise taxes against the wishes of many in their own party. The east coast of the United States struggles with several feet of snow, high winds and flooding, leaving thousands of people without power. And there's not much snow in the Caribbean. How Jamaica's bobsleigh team is on the road to the Winter Olympics in Beijing. The UK is considering doubling its NATO troop deployment in Eastern Europe amid continuing fears that Russia could invade Ukraine. But NATO has reiterated that sending troops into Ukraine itself is not on the cards, a line echoed by Britain's Foreign Secretary. Russia, meanwhile, has responded to security pledges made by NATO, saying they do not go far enough and need clarification. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Natalie Carney in East Ukraine. Natalie, a lot of diplomatic developments from all sides over the last 24 hours. What's been said?
Yes, well, as you rightly mentioned, the United Kingdom is considering upping the number of troops that it has in Eastern Europe, as well as sending defensive weapons to Estonia. Currently, there's about 1,100 UK troops in the region. These new troops would be in addition, of course, to the small contingency of American forces that are being sent over. Earlier on, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that these moves will send a clear message to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has, of course, built up quite a substantial military presence along three Ukrainian fronts. The Prime Minister tweeted earlier on Sunday that the picture of Ukraine's borders looked increasingly concerning, and he urged Moscow to engage in negotiations as well as avoid a reckless and catastrophic invasion. The Prime Minister is expected in the region later on in the week. As well, he is expected to be having a telephone conversation with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, as you said as well, there are troops that are being moved to Eastern Europe from NATO, but those troops will not be crossing the border into Ukraine itself and fighting alongside the Ukrainian army should an invasion take place. And that's according to the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg.
We have no plans to deploy NATO combat troops to Ukraine. NATO allies have trainers there. NATO allies also provide equipment, defensive weapons, like the UK has now provided, for instance, anti-tank weapons. So we do a lot of stuff to help Ukraine strengthen its capability to defend itself.
Natalie, on the ground, what's going on there in terms of military activity and public concern?
Well, the latest, or the closest front line from where we are in Kramatorsk in the Donetsk Oblast is about 45 kilometers from here. And from what I've heard from some of the residents, it's very quiet. In fact, almost too quiet, according to some of them. We're here in front of City Hall, and there's quite a lively atmosphere with people going by and enjoying the cold weathers here. But if you also look at the calculations from the Organization of Security and Cooperation for Europe, the OSCE, they've got a monitoring mission that goes along the border and takes reports on the activity in the conflict zones. And they reported 11 ceasefire violations in the Donetsk Oblast on Saturday. And if you compare that to what they saw on Friday, Friday, that was 173, so it's quite a substantial drop. Luhansk had, the Oblats next door, had 19 ceasefire violations on Saturday, and on Friday had 93. So if you look at those figures alone, yes, you would think that the situation might be improving somewhat, but some people are also saying, could this be the calm before the storm? So we're still seeing some military exercises, of course, taking place with the Ukrainian army, and a lot of civilians are still signing up to become reservists for the Ukrainian army should the Russians cross the border and invade this country.
Natalie, thanks for that. Natalie Carney, our correspondent in East Ukraine. Governments around the world are grappling with how to pay for the huge increase in spending caused by the coronavirus pandemic. In the UK, there's strong opposition to a 1.25 percentage point tax rise to fund the backlog in the healthcare service. But the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and his Chancellor, his Finance Minister, Rishi Sunak, have issued a joint statement insisting the tax rise will go ahead. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Andrew Wilson, who's been following the story for us. Andrew, the UK, like many other economies, has huge debts from supporting the pandemic and supporting businesses in the pandemic. But this tax rise to ease the burden is deeply unpopular, isn't it?
It's really unpopular within the Conservative Party, Jamie. They're not a party who likes to be taxing the general public. They don't believe that's the way to grow the economy. And it was certainly, it looked as though Boris Johnson was going to give up on the idea a couple of weeks ago when he badly needed friends and support within the party. Now, the fact that he and Rishi Sunak have now buried their differences on that and agreed together that this hike will go ahead is a sign of their determination to get the coffers refilled again after the spending of the pandemic, but also a sign that Boris Johnson is now a more confident leader than he was 2 weeks ago. The money's considerable, $45 billion they're going to raise with this 1.25% hike in national insurance. It's not direct, it's not income tax on people's incomes. It's a fixed levy destined only for welfare projects like pensions, government pensions and healthcare and so on. So that's what they're calling it, a healthcare levy rather than taxation. But of course it is part of the pay packet taxation. But it is a sign that Boris Johnson and his Chancellor are talking together again, and also that they're getting on with their jobs and starting to create a bit of policy in all the chaos.
Well, let's just drill down to that a little more, because the Finance Minister, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is one of the front runners to succeed Boris Johnson if he's forced to resign over the so-called Partygate scandal. So the two of these men tying their political fortunes together in this way, defending this tax rise, is pretty significant, isn't it?
It is. Let's look at the situation a couple of weeks ago, again, when Boris Johnson was really looking like he was in trouble, and he made a very po-faced apology to the House of Commons about the parties that have been taking place and the fact there was an investigation going on. It carries on in Downing Street and so on, and one by one, after that apology in public, his ministers went onto social media and said, we support the Prime Minister, we support the Prime Minister. But it was Rishi Sunak and, funnily enough, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, who were the last to offer their support to the Prime Minister. Now, that was taken at the time as a sign that perhaps Sunak and also Truss were preparing to challenge the leadership and perhaps gather some support around themselves to unseat Boris Johnson. Well, now that's no longer really seems to be the lay of the land now. 2 weeks later, you've got Rishi Sunak. If he had any ambitions to take over the Premiership, they've been buried again. And that's how the Conservative Party works. You don't show your hand unless you're confident that there being a leadership challenge that will be held. You don't want to be declaring your lack of loyalty to the Prime Minister before there's a leadership competition underway. It seems as if that's gone away. The other thing to notice is that it's always a tricky relationship, Prime Minister and Chancellor in British politics. Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, David Cameron and George Osborne. Usually it's assumed the Chancellor has his eye on the top job, so there is friction, and there's also arguments quite a lot about money, about spending and about saving. No different in this government with Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. But for now, as I say, they seem to be back in step.
Andrew, the UK Finance Minister Rishi Sunak has also said he wants to reset the trade relationship with China, hasn't he?
Well, it's been an interesting 7 years in terms of relations with China, from the red carpet being rolled out in 2015 to the scuffles and rejections over Huawei UK and the political clashes over Hong Kong and the human rights and other issues within China. So that's caused some ruffles and disturbances amongst the British political body, and the Conservative Party is home to many of those people who object to closer relations with China. However, this is a reality check from Rishi Sunak. Now, there used to be regular meetings once a year, trade delegations between China and the UK to look at investment and trade possibilities. That stopped in 2019, partly because of the pandemic and partly because of those pressures that I mentioned. Rishi Sunak wants to revive that again. So he's hoping that April, May time, perhaps not in person with delegations flying around the world, but perhaps remotely on Zoom and on other kinds of media, that conversations should be struck up again between China and the UK in terms of banking, financial services, commodities such as beef and pork and other agricultural products, and all the rest of it. It's something the US has already led the way on. Politically, the US has a lot of noises on to make about what it feels about China, but at the same time, it does allow elements of its economy to carry on trading with China, because that's real politics. And I think Rishi Sunak is following that same line. He's saying we need to build a post-Brexit Britain that trades everywhere in our own interests, and it's in our own interest to have a relationship with one of the largest economies in the world.
Andrew, thanks for that. Andrew Wilson, our correspondent. The DPRK has conducted its biggest missile test in nearly 5 years. A medium-range ballistic weapon reportedly reached an altitude of 2,000 kilometers before landing in the Sea of Japan. It's the latest in a string of missile tests this year. Our correspondent Jack Barton reports now from Seoul.
The third week and the fourth missile, and the very fact that the Joint Chiefs of Staff here in South Korea have reached out to reporters to alert them to this test is a sign that it is most likely a ballistic missile, because they don't do that for anything that's sort of under that category. Japan also saying they think it is another ballistic missile, and it is deeply alarming to officials here. We've seen 2 tests from trains so far this year, and 2 of what the DPR calls hypersonic missiles. Even South Korea officials acknowledging that the last one flew at Mach 10, 10 times the speed of sound. But now it seems to be tit-for-tat retaliation between the DPRK and the United States, which slapped sanctions on 6 individuals residing in China and Russia, DPRK citizens, and now the US threatening more. The DPRK threatening stronger action. Kim Jong-un talking about building up the weapon stockpile in terms of quality and quantity, and what it seems to be leading to is more and more of these tests. And it has really taken South Korean officials on the back foot. Even as early as the start of this month, President Moon Jae-in still talking about a big push towards peace, about finding an end of war peace agreement, and about improving dialogue.
Jack Barton reporting from Seoul. Winds of 144 kilometres per hour are expected to hit the north of the UK just a day after 2 people were killed during Storm Malik. A boy in England and a woman in Scotland died after being hit by falling trees caused by high winds. Many homes have been left without power, and a second storm called Corrie is set to cause more disruption later on Sunday. And much of the US East Coast is dealing with a massive winter storm. Almost 6,000 flights have been cancelled, with transport disruption and power cuts for thousands of people. On New York's Long Island, nearly half a metre of snow has fallen. Our correspondent William Denslow reports now from New York City.
In total, officials say that New York City could see a total of 12 inches of snowfall over this weekend. But New York City isn't expected to see the worst of the snowfall. Parts of Long Island are expected to see up to 24 inches of snow. It's also expected to see that figure around the Boston area as well. Of course, 5 states in total have declared states of emergency. And it's not just the snow that is the concern for officials. Wind gusts of around 50 miles an hour are a huge concern. There's also fears of coastal flooding in some communities as well. In total, as well as these 5 states that have declared states of emergency, 10 states in total could see blizzard-like conditions. And in total, according to some estimates, some 75 million people could be impacted in some way by these blizzards. We've already seen in the state of Massachusetts more than 100,000 homes have lost power. Thousands of flights already cancelled this weekend in the United States. The message really from officials in this region of the US is that if you are impacted by this snow and by these blizzards, stay home as much as possible, hunker down and wait for it to pass. William Denslow, CGTN, New York.
A cable repair ship is expected to reach Tonga in the next few hours, 2 weeks after the volcanic eruption and tsunami damaged international undersea communication lines. The vessel set off 10 days ago from Papua New Guinea, and our correspondent Greg Navarro reports now from Fiji.
It's really fascinating. This ship, just taking a look at what it does, it can carry more than 5,000 metric tons of cable. That may sound like a lot, but when you consider what we're dealing with, it's really not the case. We're talking about a cable that, as you mentioned, it stretches from Tonga to here in Fiji, about 750 to 800 kilometers long. It is extremely long. More importantly, it is the only cable linking Tonga to the rest of the world as far as communications go. And you may remember the day of the volcano and tsunami, communications were basically cut off. They had a blackout for at least 5 days. Even today, more than 2 weeks after that disaster, communications are still an issue, especially internet access. Now, that ship left Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea 10 days ago. It is scheduled to arrive in Tonga today. Engineers on board believe there are probably 2 breaks in that cable, but there are a lot of unknowns, including the concern about any kind of underwater activity that might have caused some debris to collapse on top of that cable. Now, the way they're going to actually figure out exactly where those breaks are on the repair, it's really fascinating. They're going to use a fiber optic cable, and they're going to emit a signal basically through that. And when the signal bounces back to them, they'll measure the amount of time that they took. They'll use that to determine exactly where those breaks are. They'll then remove a section of the cable where the breaks are and replace it with a new one and eventually splice it. The amazing part about this, all of this takes place well under the surface of the ocean. They'll use some robotic equipment as well. If all goes well, they do expect to have communications back restored, that cable back restored, in about 2 weeks.
CGTN's Greg Navarro reporting from Fiji. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, no snow, snow problem. How Jamaica's bobsleigh team is on the road to reach the Winter Olympics in Beijing.
Beijing, China's capital and its cultural nerve center, a modern metropolis with traditional roots. And now it becomes the first city in the world to host both Summer and Winter Olympics. After 14 years, the biggest sporting extravaganza returns to Beijing. Thousands of athletes from around the globe will compete in over 100 events at 3 zones. Cheered on by over 1.4 billion Chinese citizens and millions abroad. CGTN will bring you a ringside view of the historic event. 2022 Beijing Olympics, the games that matter, on CGTN. See the difference.
This week on Razor, how long is a second really? We find out from Chinese-American physicist Jun Yi, who's changing the way we measure time.
Together with my students and postdocs in our lab, we have built one of the most precise atomic clocks in the world. So precise that it has a variation of less than 1 second in 15 billion years.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. NATO says it will train and support the Ukrainian army, but it will not join the fight against Russia if it invades. DPRK carries out a test launch of its biggest missile since 2017, the 7th launch this month. And paying for the pandemic, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Finance Minister Rishi Sunak say they'll raise taxes against the wishes of many in their own party. Portuguese voters are going to the polls to choose their next government, with analysts predicting it'll be a close race. The Socialist Prime Minister Antonio Costa is looking for a 3rd consecutive term, but is facing a strong challenge from the centre-right opposition. Our correspondent Rahul Pathak is in the Portuguese capital, Lisbon.
Well, early on, voter turnout has been slightly low amid this rise in Omicron COVID infections that we've had here in Portugal. But I think this may change as the day goes on, as people realise how close this election is going to be and that every single vote is going to count. The weather is certainly not going to be an issue. It's an absolutely beautiful day here in Lisbon. But as I said, every vote is going to be vital as the two main parties, the incumbent Socialist Party and the main opposition Social Democrats Party, desperately try and form the next government. Whoever does form that next administration will get to decide how to spend $50 billion worth of European Union aid to help Portugal recover from the pandemic. So the stakes are pretty high, but we're still a very long way away from finding out who that's going to be. One thing we can be pretty certain of is that it's not going to be a majority government. In the last 50 years, Portugal has just had three majority governments. So this is a country that's used to being governed by a coalition. And it would not surprise me in the least if the horse trading has already begun between the major players and some of the smaller parties to see if they can do a deal and form that next administration.
Israel's President Isaac Herzog has visited the United Arab Emirates to strengthen diplomatic ties between the two countries. His office said it was the first visit of its kind. The UAE, Bahrain and Israel all share common concerns about Iran and signed a US-brokered agreement in 2020. The Israeli presidency is a largely ceremonial post. Israel's Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, visited the UAE in December. France says an Iran nuclear deal is still possible, but talks need to accelerate. Emmanuel Macron told his Iranian counterpart that the sanctions could be lifted if Tehran curbs its nuclear ambitions. People in the northern Irish city of Londonderry, also known as Derry, have marched to commemorate events 50 years ago which saw 13 unarmed protesters killed by British soldiers. Bloody Sunday was one of the most notorious incidents during decades of violence in Northern Ireland known as the Troubles. Several victims were shot in the back or while they were on the ground by members of the British Parachute Regiment who fired into crowds during a protest against British rule. Spring festival celebrations in London are usually the biggest in the world outside Asia, but after cancellation, of course, in 2021, this year's event will also be scaled back somewhat due to the coronavirus pandemic. Chinese restaurants in the city, however, will still be cooking up sumptuous cuisine to mark the Year of the Tiger. CGTN's Stephen Cole visited Chinatown in one of the world's most prestigious hotels.
The Chinatown restaurant here at the Dorchester Hotel in London is home to some of the finest, authentic Cantonese food to be found outside China. Chinatown bears the unmistakable fingerprint of the flamboyant creator Sir David Tang. The theme of the restaurant is olden days Shanghai, but the bar here is based on a 1930s imagination of Sir David's living room, where if you want to, you can also experience a Cantonese afternoon tea. In here, the dining room is served classical Cantonese dishes using the freshest ingredients to showcase centuries of perfected recipes, from the dim sum menus to favourites such as mapo tofu, yu xiang aubergine, and my favourite succulent char siu pork, including the ultimate centrepiece, though, Peking duck. This place is a genuine celebration of Cantonese cooking. And I'm going to meet the man in charge, John Mann.
You know, we don't have a New Year's menu, but we will have New Year's specials, which will include the auspicious dishes, sea moss, dried oysters. Again, you know, is a homophone. Dried oyster in Chinese, fat hou xi, means good times. Sea moss is fat choy. That means it's a homophone for getting rich. We Chinese are you know, we're obsessed about good fortune. So you've got to have fish.
Why fish?
The word fish in Chinese, yu, also means abundance. So, you know, when you have a fish dish, we always preface it with a little couplet, you know, nin nin yao yu. That means every year we'll have abundance. So if you eat the fish, you're going to have abundance in the year ahead.
And you can see the full interview in the agenda with Stephen Cole next weekend. Tennis, and Rafael Nadal has won a record-breaking 21st men's Grand Slam title with victory in the Australian Open in one of the greatest tennis matches of all time. He achieved victory in spectacular fashion, coming back from two-sets down to beat Russia's Daniil Medvedev in a 5-hour and 24-minute match in Melbourne. The Spaniard, who last won the Australian Open in 2009, has moved ahead of big rivals Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, who both have 20 singles titles. Now, when it comes to famous Winter Olympic stories, the exploits of the first Jamaican bobsleigh team is near the top of most lists. It was immortalised in the 1993 Disney film Cool Runnings. Well, now they're back for real and training for Beijing, not on snow but on wheels. And in the UK city of Bath, John Beaver reports.
They are the most unlikely competitors who'll be in Beijing.
Come on then. Let's work hard. 15, yeah?
The Jamaican bobsleigh team may be the underdogs.
Ready? 10. 2, 3.
But they're not there to just make up the numbers.
We would love gold. Who doesn't want gold? You know, we work hard for it, and you know, we're aiming for the gold. But I think the other thing would be to be the best Jamaican team that's ever gone to the Olympics, and that's beating 14th place. So if we can do that or better, you know, we'll be happy.
With budgets a fraction of those major countries operate with, being part of this team is far from glamorous. But what they lack in finances, they make up for in support and media interest. The team don't mind the constant references to the Cool Runnings film, based loosely on the exploits of the 1988 Olympic team.
When it comes to like Cool Runnings in Jamaica, I don't think it has like the popularity. It's not a popular sport. Bob says it's not a popular sport in Jamaica, as in like track and field or football. But when you go outside of Jamaica, the appreciation that we get as a team, it's amazing.
Jamaica have qualified for the 4-man, 2-man and women's monobob in China, a huge achievement given the limited experience. The 4-man team only got in a bobsleigh together a few months ago. The last-minute training will continue as these underdogs hope to pull off a major shock and win a new generation of fans. From Jamaica via the UK, the next stop is the Winter Olympics in Beijing. The Jamaican bobsleigh team will be competing against the best in the world and hoping to do their country proud. John Beaver, CGTN, Bath.
The headlines again. NATO says it'll train and support the Ukrainian army, but it will not join the fight against Russia if it invades. Our other headlines: the DPRK carries out a test launch of its biggest missile since 2017, the 7th launch this month. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Finance Minister Rishi Sunak say they'll raise taxes against the wishes of many in their own party. And the east coast of the United States struggles with several feet of snow, high winds and flooding, leaving thousands of people without power. And that's the world today. Thank you for watching. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview. More news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's Razor. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.